about in Children's Church. Today we're talking about Jonah. We have actually done a few of the minor prophets. We did Hosea, we did Joel, we did Amos, we did Obadiah, and now we're on Jonah. And Jonah is one of my favorites, and partly why he's one of my favorites is because of this book, because it means it's real easy to preach on. Jonah wasn't something I actually ever planned on writing on. He wasn't a prophet I ever thought about it. I mean, beyond that, I had said, okay, yeah, I'm going to do an entire commentary on all the Bible books. I didn't expect to do Jonah as soon as I did. I think I did this last year, if I recall correctly. I think I wrote it between 2014 and then we published it in 2015 in January. And so I started that at the end of 2014. And I didn't realize what God was really trying to go for with Jonah, what he was trying to reveal to me, until I really started to get into it. And this is the story that's inspired Jonah. I visited a church in Chapel Hill in 2014 that's one of these more modern churches that's real, what they call seeker-friendly. And when a church is seeker-friendly, it means its emphasis is on making sure that visitors are comfortable. That if you are not a Christian and you've never been a Christian before, that you need to be comfortable in church. So they're what I would call atmosphere setters. They tend to be very relaxed. People are not dressed up. The pastor was up there in a button-down shirt and jeans that looked like he mowed the lawn, and they didn't even look clean. And he wasn't really a very good speaker, and the way that he presented the word wasn't real knowledgeable. It was very laid back. And when it was worship time, the whole room was so dark I couldn't see my hand in front of me. And they had the stage up there and the band, and they're all dressed down, and they're all singing, and there's a slideshow behind them while they're with the words, while they're doing it. At one point, they were moving really fast, and I'm real fascinated with subliminal messages, so I'm literally like this trying to read them. But when we were on our way into the church, there was a man that was outside that was smoking his last cigarette before service. Then on the way out, I saw that man again smoking his first cigarette after service. And what I've said is I understand that people have different struggles. I don't want him to say, like no smokers are welcome into church. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that we can't have our issues. But my point that kind of came to me, especially when seeing the man and talking to him, was his response was very interesting. Oh yeah, I'm here having my first cigarette after service. Oh yeah, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And he didn't really seem like he had any conviction or any challenge within him to really deal with or start to change that. And so the thing that I asked the person I attended the service with, who got very annoyed at me, was, where is the point in our faith where we start to get uncomfortable with God? Because if you're truly a believer, and if you are truly somebody who is called of God to be where you are, even if you're not a prophet, and I don't even think that Jonah and the issues that Jonah had are exclusive to leaders or to people who are in leadership. I think that it does teach us about being a leader. I think that it does teach us about proper attitudes in leadership and proper issues. I don't think that what Jonah went through is unique to Jonah and is unique to prophets. I think that it's something that we all go through. When I took on Jonah, somebody described Jonah in the book and basically said that the book of Jonah was Jonah being something very derogative. That it was an experience, the story of Jonah being something not really nice and rather vulgar in the way that he described it. But doesn't that sound automatically like we're judging Jonah? And the reason I say that is because we have all had something that God told us to do that we don't want to do. Whether it's something as simple as we talked about in Children's Church, where you don't want to do your chores, or you don't want to do what you're told, or you don't want to do what you're being told to do by God. This was something that we all deal with in our own lives. And what happens is that it brings us to the end of ourselves. Jonah, and when we talk about Jonah being in the belly of the whale, everybody goes all literal, everybody argues over whether or not that's even possible. The reality of Jonah is that we all wind up in the belly of the whale at some point in time in our lives, where God reduces us to that point where it's just Him and us, and where we have to really examine what we believe in order to make sure that it really matches who God is. Because an awful lot of us believe a lot of things that aren't God. God would never do this. God would never do that. God shouldn't do this. God shouldn't do that. God won't ask me to do that. I remember knowing a woman years ago who actually outright said, I love my house, I want my house, God's not going to ask me to sell my house. Well, this was the joke. She had people come up to her asking her to buy that house, offering her money for that house. Now, if that's not a sign that God's telling you to do something, I don't know what is, but she would not accept that. And so what happened is she had to go through different experiences in her life where she wound up in that metaphorical place where she's got to deal with what she believes about God versus who God is. And that's what Jonah really challenges us to do. That's what Jonah challenges us in our own lives to do. Because our own thoughts and feelings creep into our ministering, and they creep into our Christian belief system. I dealt with it with somebody this week, had a certain perception or attitude of what they're doing, but if we step back and we listen to it, and if we talk about it, you're charging people $500 a year to help them get out of poverty. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, you're charging them $500 a year to give them tips and strategies on how to not be in poverty. But they feel that they're biblical. And when I challenged that man on that, he argued with me and turned it around like I wasn't biblical. So, some point in time, we don't need to deal with this, or we deal with the reduction of our own selves, where we stay in the belly of the whale, some of us way longer than 3 days. Some of us are in there for years because we aren't capturing the revelation that God is bigger than we understand and bigger than we try to make him out to be. So when I wrote this book, that was really the challenge that was before me, and it was something I started thinking about. It took me back to philosophy class. It took me back to all these different things. We need to be people who God changes, and we need to allow God to change us. And it is a process. It is something that happens over time, and it is something that happens from glory to glory and faith to faith, but it is something that we have to allow God to do within us. Jonah himself is not specifically identified as the author of the book, but most people do assume him to be the author, although I read a book not long ago that theorizes that Jonah never actually really lived, that it's just a story that is told in order to prove that racism is wrong and not being willing to interact with other people is wrong, and, you know, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, I guess that, to me, I don't see it that way because I think it's very probable that there was a prophet who was just like this in history. And I think that I know it's true because I see Jonahs all the time. We see people all the time who start their projects who do have some knowledge of God. Jonah was not without knowledge of God. He wasn't a new believer. He wasn't seeker-friendly. He wasn't a baby prophet. We can read that from the Bible. But he was somebody who didn't like what God asked him to do. And so Jonah's alive and well even today. Jonah exists in every minister that ever lived at some level. Maybe it's different issues or different things, but Jonah does very much exist. We don't learn a whole lot about Jonah's life, like where he was from and who his father was and, you know, where his birthplace was, because none of that's relevant. This really is a character book. It's a heart book. We learn a lot about Jonah as a person from it. And so it's very important to see that, and not to just see that, but to see us. Jonah was written somewhere between the 8th and 4th centuries BC. He himself probably lived during the reign of Jeroboam II, which was between 706 and 746 BC. And the book covers an unspecified period of time. A lot of people assume it to be post-exilic because of the way that Jonah felt toward the Assyrians. Nineveh was this very large and financially prosperous by ancient standards city. So they were people who had money. And we find in 2 Kings 14:25 that Jonah was a prophet, and he had been one for quite some time. So like I said, this wasn't a new believer, this wasn't a new person, this was somebody that really had been very experienced with God and had experience with hearing the voice of God and with knowing what God had told him to do. And so was Jonah always obedient before this happened? I don't know. We don't really know. It's not really relevant. I think that we all can reach a certain point in time where we're real obedient to God right up until he asks us that one thing. And so he might have not ever had an issue with God before, he might have. But what I would say is God had probably already been dealing with Jonah. And I say that because of the response that he gave that was so virulent to what God asked him to do. That God was already probably dealing with him, and that this is somebody who knew God well enough to argue with him, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. Now, how many of us all do that? I'm going to raise my hand. I'm not going to lie that, you know, God has asked me to do stuff at times, and I want to do it, and God and I will fight about it. I'll go, God, I don't want to do that. I can't believe you want me to do that. Are you really serious, God? I don't want to do that. What is the point in doing that? What is the point in doing, you know? And God and I will go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So they had a certain familiarity, and he had a certain understanding because he was a human being, just like all of us are, just like we all are. The catch is that, or the difference is that we may struggle with God, but we will get to a point where hopefully we will obey him. If we don't, we wind up in Jonah's position. And so Jonah also, I think it's important to say that he didn't run from God. A lot of people say that Jonah ran from his calling, or that he ran from God. He ran from an assignment that God gave him to do. He didn't run from his calling. He didn't stop being a prophet. He didn't run from God, period. He just didn't do what God asked him to do. And so when we start to understand a little bit more about Jonah, which we're going to go to the text in a minute, we are able to see ourselves better, and we're able to see more of what happened, because I think that there's a lot of fluff added to Jonah. You know, think about the Sunday school books. I remember this Sunday school book that I had, and this was years ago, and it had Jonah riding on the back of the whale, you know, like he was going surfing. No, it's not that kind of an experience, and it's not that kind of a thing, but we need to be very careful about esteeming ourselves properly as we read Jonah in order to see what God wants to tell us through it. And we're going to start in verse 1 of chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. What I absolutely love about the first part of this is how it says, all right, the word of the Lord came, and Jonah just didn't do it. Jonah just did the exact opposite. I love those glasses. Jonah just did whatever he wanted to do. He just did his own thing, and it doesn't even indicate he had fear of God. It doesn't even indicate that he had fear of what God might do, or of God's power. Well, like I said, how many of us have done the exact same thing? That God tells us to do something and we disobey, and we don't have any fear about disobeying it because we go, oh, God won't do that, or God won't do it to me. Oh, what do we do today? Oh, well, I'm a believer, and I'm under the blood, and I'm saved, and I'm this, and I'm that. And we don't consider that we may very well reap something from God that we don't like. And so he just did whatever he wanted. He just did whatever he felt like it. He ran away from what God told him to do. He ran away from his assignment. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, verse 4, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, and we will not perish. So Jonah wasn't even worried. He wasn't even a little bit afraid, because he was so confident that he knew better than God, or he understood God better than God was telling him to do that. He didn't have to obey. He didn't have to do what God told him to do. And what we're seeing here is human response, is where we start writing in our doctrine into what God assigns us to do. And that was why I talked today to Brooke when we had Sunday school on a level that she could understand, but it's the same type of principle with us. There are things that God is telling us to do all the time that we think we don't have to do, because God wouldn't ask that of us. Because when we learned this Bible, we learned our doctrine first. And we started reading that doctrine in between all of the different lines. And so we have all this understanding today that God won't do this, God won't do that, God won't be this, God won't be that. And what happened is the Assyrians had captured the Israelites. They had been in captivity under them, and they were very cruel, and they were a very aggressive neighbor. And so Jonah didn't like them. Understandable. Jonah didn't like his own oppressors, the people who had oppressed his people. They thought that they were superior to everybody else around it. And so what happened is this created the early strains of the racism that we tend to see in a lot of different communities today, because Israel was already working on that they were chosen and that they were set apart and that they were the ones who were really superior. And so you had a racial battle in there to a certain extent, national, racial, cultural battle, and that Jonah didn't feel that they were worthy of repentance, that they were worthy of the chance to know God or the chance to repent. And so what happened is he wasn't worried at all. He was not at all worried that God was going to come and send this big, huge storm. He just went to sleep. He was so confident that he was right and that he was going to be okay. He was wrong. Verse 7, then the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity. And they cast lots, and the lots fell on Jonah. Ha, 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 God told on Jonah. So they asked him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? He answered, I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. This terrified them, and they asked, what have you done? They knew he was running away from the Lord, because he'd already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? And what does Jonah say? What is Jonah's response? How does he kind of work? And he says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. In other words, go down into the pool. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land. But they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried to the Lord, O Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So Jonah shows us what happens when we shirk our assignment. And he also shows us in a very deep way what it means in order to be called to the nations. You can't be called to the nations and be a bigot. You can't be called to the nations and not know where you're going. You can't be called to the nations and not know what any other nation believes or where any other nation is. Because whenever we use our beliefs to try and trump God, our theology is no good, and we wind up in the belly of the whale. We wind up with that kind of a sign, because in that process, when we're down there, we come to really know God. We come to really know God because our call becomes about something more than what God has asked us to do. Chapter 2, verse 1. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled around me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs, but I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will make good, for salvation comes to the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto the dry land. So Jonah experienced God for himself. He experienced God in a way that challenged everything that he thought about. And so we need to step back and think about all the things that we say that we believe. Because it says here in Jonah 2 that those who cling to worthless idols forfeit grace. Anything can be an idol. Even our own concept of God. And that's something that's a challenge to the church today, because we have made God in our own image. We've made him comfortable. We've made him Western in terms of not like John Wayne. Although there are probably some people who've made him like John Wayne. But comfortable, that we should have certain things, that we should look a certain way, that we should be a certain way. But God is beyond all these perceptives. He's beyond all these concepts. He's beyond all these things, because we need to be aware of challenging God in the way that we so often do. Because by disobeying God, Jonah challenged God. I'll believe God if. I'll believe God when. I'll believe God if I get a husband. I'll believe God if I get a car. I'll believe God if I get all this money. I'll believe God if I get a new job. I'll believe God if my rent or my mortgage is paid. I'll believe in God when he does this. I'll believe in God when my ministry is bigger. I'll believe God for this. And so, in other words, when we dare God to be God, we wind up in the big belly of a big fish. We wind up in that place because God does not have to prove himself to us. God does not have to do things our way. He doesn't have to do them the way that we want. And it makes us think over what we're doing. But how we're going to tie this in terms of things, and we're not going to go to the passage, but we're going to talk about the sign of Jonah, which is spoken of in the New Testament, and we understand that in the literal sense to be a reference to the resurrection. That because Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, that signifies Jesus being in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, and then rising up. And so we understand it in that vein. But when Jesus talked to the Pharisees and said, you'll receive no sign except the sign of Jonah, he was also telling them that God was going to reveal himself to them and that they were going to have to be humbled before that. And so instead of being so quick to look down on Jonah, we need to see what's going on in the world. We need to see what's going on within ourselves and within the church. And all the ways that we're still in the belly of the whale not rising up, where we're still witnessing the sign of Jonah, where we've had an experience where God brings us to a point where he shows up and shows out as God, but it's not in the way that we're challenging him to do it. And so in the belly of the whale, we sit there while we watch God move, or we watch God show up and show out in a way that maybe challenges where we are, challenges our understanding of God, and challenging stuff, because we need to come up and we need to resurrect and we need to reach that point where we know God for ourselves. God does not automatically sound like us. You know what? After we've been in God for a certain period of time, we should pick up some of God's perspectives and we should understand what God is saying to us. We should know before we even dare to challenge God on something what God is going to say about it. And I've done that. I go, okay, God, I'm not even going to ask you because I already know what you're going to say or what you're going to do. But that's that experience that we get from that. So the sign of Jonah is a lot more than just about a physical resurrection. It's also about a spiritual one. And dying to what we think we know and being raised then to what we do know. Because that's what God wants to do within us. Jonah might have been a fantastic prophet. And he must have been, because his ministry really did go before this, and I assume it went after it. I don't think that he just stopped. That Jonah really had a work within him or a move within him that was really good. And he had something that was very effective and something that was very poignant. He can't say, as we'll read next week, well, we do Jonah 3 and 4. He can't say his ministry wasn't effective. You know, some of us step back and we go, oh my God, nobody's listening. Oh my God, we can't get anybody to do this. God, come on, what are you doing? You know, we go that route. He was very effective. He was very effective about what he did. He was very effective about what he said, and he reached people's hearts. So he had an effective ministry. He had a purposed work. But he needed to know God in a deeper way in order to make that better. And every single one of us can come to that point where we know that. And so what we need to do, and what God is calling us to do in this hour, is to look at our belly of the whale experience, for lack of a better way to put it, and look at where we are and look at what's around us and look at how we got there. Because a lot of times we look at literal desolation in order to take us to that point. But that's not always the case. We can be in spiritual desolation. We cannot be hearing from God like we want to, or we cannot be as effective as maybe we would like to be or we want to. And we need to sit around and look and pray this prayer and look at God, pray to him and rise unto him, and look around at the idols that we have, that we are clinging to, that we have created, that are substituting for God, so that we can truly come to know God for who he is and who he is going to continue to be in our work.